Imagine you're sitting inside your home. No war drums, no fire on the horizons, no screaming from beyond the walls. Just a man stumbling through the market gate, face drained of color, barely able to stand. And when he finally speaks, 2 words are enough to stop everything. They're coming, not tomorrow, not next week, still hundreds of miles away. But within hours, something shifts. Mothers pull their children inside without explaining why. Fathers stand in doorways, staring at nothing. Priests are praying, not for victory, not even for protection, just for it to be quick. What could drive ordinary people, people with homes, with children, with everything still intact, to choose death before a single enemy soldier ever appeared? That's the question tonight, and the answer is darker than you think.
The year is 1221. The city of Merv. Over 200,000 people. One of the most important cities on Earth, markets full of silk and spices. Minarets cutting into a blue sky. Libraries that held centuries of accumulated knowledge. This was not a small town. This was a civilization. Then the news arrived. Not soldiers, not arrows. Just a merchant, half dead, barely coherent, who had somehow survived long enough to reach the gates. He had one thing to report. The Mongols had taken Samarkand. Not besieged it. Not damaged it, taken it. A city with walls. With an army. With every strategic advantage. Gone in days. Within hours. Merv changed, not loudly. That's what makes it disturbing. There was no riot. No mass exodus. Just a quiet that settled over the streets like something physical. It wasn't panic. Panic still has energy in it. Still carries the assumption that running might help. This was different. This was the stillness of people doing the math and not liking the answer. Families locked their doors. Some started packing, not much. Just what they could carry. Others didn't bother. A few walked to the temples, sat down, and didn't leave. Some began preparing for something they couldn't say out loud. And the Mongols hadn't even crossed the horizon. Here's what haunts historians about this moment. The people of Merv weren't cowards. They'd survived invasions before. They understood siege warfare. They had walls, soldiers, supplies. By any rational calculation. They had options, but rational calculation had stopped working. Because what was coming wasn't just an army. It was a verdict. And somewhere in the stories that had traveled ahead of the Mongols, in the specific details, the things survivors had described, something had broken through every instinct for survival these people had. What exactly had they heard? What could be so much worse than death, that death started to look like the better choice? To understand the fear, you have to understand what built it. In the early 1200s, a man named Temujin united the warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe under one banner. He renamed himself. The world would know him as Genghis Khan. And at first, the world beyond the steppe barely noticed. That would not last long. What Genghis built wasn't just a larger army. It was a different kind of machine, entirely. One the medieval world had no framework to understand and no existing strategy to counter. His cavalry covered 80 to 100 miles a day. Think about what that meant in the 13th century. A city receives a warning. Messengers ride out. By the time the warning reaches the next settlement, the Mongols are already closer than anyone calculated. The math kept failing people. The speed kept winning before the battle started. But speed was only part of it. Their intelligence network ran months ahead of the army. Merchants on the Silk Road were watched, questioned, sometimes recruited. Scouts mapped water sources, roads, political tensions inside city walls. By the time a Mongol commander looked at a city from the outside, he already knew which gates were weakest, which local rulers resented the others, and roughly how many defenders were actually willing to fight. They didn't just show up. They arrived already knowing. And then there was what happened to the cities that said no. Zhongdu, Samarkand, Urgench, Nishapur. Each one had armies. Each one had walls. Each one made the decision to resist. Nishapur, one of the great intellectual centers of the Islamic world, a city of poets and philosophers, resisted in 1221. When the walls finally broke, what followed wasn't a battle. Witnesses described it as a process, organized, methodical. The Mongols moved through the city with an efficiency that survivors found more frightening than rage would have been. Rage, at least, is human. This felt like something else. Contemporary accounts describe the killing lasting for days. The city was dismantled so completely it never recovered. Whether every detail is accurate is something historians debate. But people believed it. And that belief, that specific visceral, spreading belief, turned out to be something the Mongols understood better than almost anyone in history. Because here's what they had figured out. They didn't just defeat enemies. They manufactured what defeat looked like. And then they made sure everyone heard about it. Here is the thing most people don't know. The Mongols let survivors escape on purpose. Not out of mercy. Not carelessness. Deliberately. After a city was destroyed, a specific number of people were released, sent, running toward the next settlement, the next city, the next ruler who hadn't yet decided whether to resist. These weren't refugees. They were a delivery system. One terrified survivor arriving at a city gate accomplished more than a regiment of scouts. They didn't need to exaggerate. The truth was already enough. But they did anyway. Because trauma does that. And every retelling added something. A number grew, a detail darkened. The story of what happened in Nishapur traveled from Persia to the edges of Europe. And by the time it arrived somewhere new, it had absorbed the fear of every person who had carried it. The Mongols understood something that most conquerors never learned. Terror travels faster than cavalry. A horseman might cover 80 miles in a day. Fear covered 500 along trade routes, through mountain passes, in the nightmares of merchants who had never even seen a Mongol and never wanted to. Cities started surrendering before the siege equipment arrived. Gates opened. Local rulers walked out with gifts, with tribute, with whatever they thought might be enough. Populations that had every military reason to fight better walls, larger armies, stronger positions simply didn't. Not because they were cowards, because the psychological war had been running for months before the army showed up. And by the time the Mongols appeared on the horizon, that war was already over. A city that surrendered quickly was absorbed, taxed, administered. A city that resisted became the next story sent ahead to the next city. The Mongols had turned their own brutality into a self-sustaining weapon. And then something started happening that even the Mongols may not have fully anticipated. The fear stopped being a reaction to what the Mongols might do. It became something people did to themselves. Inside cities that hadn't been touched, that were still weeks away from any possible Mongol advance, families were making decisions that should never exist. Conversations happening behind locked doors that no parent should ever have to have. What happens to our daughters if they get inside the walls? What happens to our sons if they're taken alive? Is it better to run? Is it better to fight? Or is it better to choose how this ends ourselves now, before that choice disappears? Historical accounts from multiple regions describe exactly this. Collective despair, not loud, not dramatic, quiet. Devastating. People choosing death not because the enemy was at the gate, but because they had already lost the ability to imagine a future on the other side of survival. And here is the question that historians have been arguing about ever since. Were the Mongols really what people believed they were? Or had fear grown so large it had started killing people all on its own, independent of anything the Mongols actually did? This is the part historians struggle to write. Not because the records are incomplete, but because what those records describe is almost impossible to hold in your head as something that actually happened to real people, mothers, fathers, children who had no idea what was coming. Start with Nishapur, one of the crown jewels of the medieval Islamic world, a city of scholars, architects, poets. When the Mongol army appeared outside its walls in 1221, the city's leaders made their decision. They chose to fight. The siege didn't last long. When the walls broke, what came through wasn't a wave of screaming soldiers. Witnesses described something quieter than that, and somehow worse. The Mongols moved through the streets in organized groups, working district by district. No frenzy, no chaos, just a cold, mechanical efficiency that survivors found harder to describe than violence would have been. At least violence is familiar. This felt like something being administered. Persian chronicles claim the dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Historians debate the exact figures, almost certainly inflated by trauma and repeated retelling. But the physical record doesn't lie. Nishapur never recovered. A city that had stood for centuries was reduced to something archaeologists would later dig through in silence. The story left immediately, carried by the few who escaped. It moved faster than any army. Then there was Merv. The governor of Merv watched what happened to Nishapur and made a different calculation. He would not fight. He walked out of the gates himself, gifts in hand. Posture of cooperation. Every signal of submission he could manage. The Mongol commander accepted. The population was told to come outside peacefully, that their lives would be spared, that cooperation would be rewarded. They came out. All of them. Hundreds of thousands of people filing through the gates over several days, leaving behind the city their families had lived in for generations. They brought what they could carry. Some probably felt something close to relief. The worst had been avoided. The nightmare scenario, the one everyone feared, wasn't going to happen. What happened instead was, in some ways, worse. Because it happened after the fear had relaxed. The Mongols separated the crowd into groups, systematically. And then the killing began, not in rage, not in retaliation, just as a continuation of the same process until almost no one remained. A small number of artisans were kept alive for their skills. A handful escaped in the chaos. Everyone else was gone. Merv, a city that had existed for longer than most empires, was finished in days. Now imagine being in Baghdad when that story arrived, or Urgench, or any of the dozens of cities that were still weeks away from the Mongol advance. Still technically safe. Still with walls and soldiers and time. What do you do with that information? If surrender didn't save Merv, a city that did everything right, that didn't resist, that gave them everything they asked for, then what exactly was the correct choice? There wasn't one. And people knew it. That is the moment the fear stopped being fear and became something that collapsed people from the inside. Inside cities that hadn't been touched. The conversations happening behind locked doors became unbearable. Not about strategy anymore. Not about whether the walls were strong enough. About daughters. About what capture meant. About whether a fast death chosen now was more merciful than whatever waited at the end of resistance or surrender. Alike, historical accounts from Persia, Central Asia, and beyond describe this, not loudly, not in the dramatic way stories usually get told, quietly, families. Entire households, people ending their own lives and their children's lives in the days and weeks before any Mongol soldier appeared on their horizon. They weren't dying because the enemy had arrived. They were dying because they had already stopped believing there was anything left on the other side. And this is where the story forces a question that even modern historians find uncomfortable, because something doesn't add up. Were the Mongols actually as total, as absolute, as unstoppable as people believed? Or had the fear, by this point, grown into something that was operating independently? The honest answer is both. And that's the most unsettling part. Some of what people feared was real, documented, verifiable. The massacres happened. The destruction of Nishapur and Merv and Urgench is supported by archaeology, by accounts from multiple cultures who had no reason to coordinate their stories, and by the demographic silence that fell over entire regions afterward. Modern studies estimate Central Asia lost somewhere between half and three-quarters of its population during the Mongol conquests. Some areas didn't recover for 200 years. You can measure that kind of loss in the archaeological record, in the cities that simply stop showing signs of habitation, in the irrigation systems that were destroyed and never rebuilt, in the libraries that disappeared and whose contents were never seen again. This wasn't legend. This was a civilizational wound. But the specific numbers people cited, the figures that appeared in medieval chronicles and traveled along with the fear, those were almost certainly inflated. A Persian historian, writing years after the fact, would record death tolls that, if taken literally, would exceed the entire population of the region. A massacre involving tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands in the retelling. A terrifying event became an impossible one, and nobody at the time had the distance or the safety to fact-check any of it. Some of the exaggeration came from trauma, from survivors trying to put language around something that had broken their ability to process reality normally. Some came from politics. Rulers who had fled without fighting needed the Mongols to be supernatural to justify their own failure. Religious leaders interpreted the advance as divine punishment, which required the punishment to be total absolute. beyond any human response. And some of it, this is the part that takes a moment to absorb, came from the Mongols themselves. Genghis Khan and his successors understood their own legend the way a modern strategist understands a media campaign. They cultivated it. They allowed stories to travel. They sent messengers ahead with ultimatums that were almost theological in their construction. We are the punishment of God. If you have not sinned, you have nothing to fear from us. If you have sinned, then what exactly do you think resistance will accomplish? Delivered to deeply religious populations, who had already begun interpreting the advance as something cosmically inevitable. That message, landing in cities already weakened by months of fear, didn't need to be militarily credible. It needed to feel true, and it did. So here is the actual truth. The Mongols were genuinely among the most destructive forces in recorded history. The violence was real. The losses were catastrophic and lasting. None of that is mythology. But the Mongols also understood that the story of their violence was nearly as powerful as the violence itself, and they managed that story with the same precision they managed their cavalry formations. Fact and legend fused together so completely that separating them became impossible. And then it stopped mattering, because perception had already become reality. The fear alone, the stories, the impossible calculations, the belief that there was no correct move was enough to bring down cities and civilizations the Mongols had never even reached. That is not a footnote in this story. That is the story at its peak. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast to the edges of Eastern Europe, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But the territory was almost the secondary achievement. What the Mongols actually conquered, the thing that lasted longer than any border, longer than the empire itself, was something that doesn't show up on maps. They conquered the imagination of an entire era. Long after the empire fragmented, the psychological damage held. Cities rebuilt their walls taller than before, not because the Mongols were still coming, but because the memory of what walls hadn't stopped had embedded itself into how people thought about safety. Rulers who had never seen a Mongol soldier made military decisions shaped by what had happened a century earlier. Entire cultures reorganized themselves around a trauma that had no clear endpoint. Historians sometimes use a phrase for what the Mongol conquests produced across Central Asia and Persia: the collapse of civilizational confidence. Not just the destruction of cities, the destruction of the belief that building things was worth it. That a library, a dynasty, a family, an irrigation system, that any of it was durable enough to justify the investment. Because all of it could vanish in days. And no walls, no armies, no political alliances, no prayers had proven otherwise. That wound outlasted the empire that created it by centuries. And this is where the story stops being only about the 13th century. Because the specific mechanism, terror, traveling faster than the army, fear doing the empire's work before the soldiers arrived, perception collapsing resistance that military force might never have broken, that mechanism didn't die with the Mongols. Every era has its version of the threat that spreads faster than it can be verified. Every generation has experienced the moment when a fear becomes so total, so absolute in the collective imagination, that people begin destroying what they love before the enemy even needs to show up. The weapon isn't always cavalry. It isn't always siege engines or arrows. Sometimes it's a story, passed from one terrified person to the next, growing darker at every handoff, until it becomes more powerful than the reality it was originally based on. The Mongols didn't always need to destroy cities. They only needed people to believe they would. And once that belief took hold, once the future stopped being imaginable, once hope became something people quietly stopped reaching for entire populations, removed the need for conquest themselves, not because the army had arrived, because fear got there first. So what do you think? Were the Mongols history's greatest masters of psychological warfare, or have centuries of retelling pushed their terror beyond anything the historical evidence can actually hold up? Leave it in the comments. We read all of them. And if stories about power, fear, and the forces that actually shape the world interest you, subscribe to Blood and Thrones. The next one is already darker than this.